The Vampire King's mother collapsed in a parking lot, blood pooling under the fluorescent lights. What the janitor didn't know, her final confession would name him guardian of a secret the king had killed thousands to bury, and now he had 72 hours before the entire court learned his face. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Marcus Webb had perfected the art of being invisible, moving through St. Mercy Hospital's employee parking lot at 11:47 p.m. with a trash bag in one gloved hand and his head down, the fluorescent lights casting sickly yellow pools across asphalt, slick with November rain, the kind of cold drizzle that soaked through cheap work jackets and made everything smell like wet concrete and regret. And he was thinking about nothing in particular, which was exactly how he liked it. 5 years of custodial work teaching him that an empty mind was a safe mind. When he found the woman collapsed between a silver Mercedes and a rusted Toyota, her designer coat spread around her like black wings, blood pooling underneath in a way that made his stomach drop because he knew that much blood meant minutes, not hours. He dropped the trash bag and his keys clattered to the pavement as he ran to her, his knees hitting the wet asphalt hard enough to bruise, and the clinical part of his brain that he'd buried 5 years ago when he quit being an EMT suddenly roared back to life, cataloging details with brutal efficiency. Puncture wounds, 2 of them, precise and surgical in their placement just below the ribs, arterial blood pumping out in weakening spurts that meant she was already circling the drain, her skin too pale even for someone dying, almost translucent in the harsh light. And when he pressed his hands to the wounds to slow the bleeding, his fingers came away slick and hot, and he was reaching for his phone with shaking hands when she grabbed his wrist. Her grip was impossible, strong enough to grind his bones together, strong enough to make him gasp. And when her eyes opened, they were pale gray like winter ice, and her canines were too long, too sharp, pressing against her lower lip as she struggled to speak, and Marcus felt reality tilt sideways because this was not possible, this was not real. But her blood was real, and her grip was real, and the terror in her eyes was devastatingly real. She pulled him closer, her breath rattling in her chest, and whispered in rapid, desperate bursts that came out half strangled, half prayer. Guardian Mark binds you to the secret. He's killed thousands to bury the truth. My daughter lives. The forest house, cedar and glass. Don't let him find her. And Marcus tried to pull away because he didn't want this. He'd spent 5 years running from responsibility and danger, and the terrible weight of holding someone's life in inadequate hands. But she pressed something small and cold into his palm, a silver locket, and her blood sealed it to his skin with heat that made him cry out. She was still talking, her voice getting weaker, each word costing her. Kieran must never know. He'll kill her to keep the throne. You hold the secret now, 72 hours until they smell me on you. Hide her, please, don't let Kieran become what I made him. And then her eyes lost focus and her grip loosened, and Marcus was doing chest compressions automatically, his body remembering what his mind had tried to forget, counting out loud in a voice that sounded nothing like his own. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, 30 compressions, 2 breaths. But there was too much blood, and her chest wouldn't rise, and somewhere in the distance, sirens were wailing, getting closer, and he knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't be here when they arrived. He looked down at the locket in his blood-slicked palm, small and ornate and impossibly heavy, then at the woman who'd just died holding his wrist, her designer coat soaked black now, her face finally peaceful in a way that made her look ancient and young at the same time, and his hand was burning where her blood had touched it. A creeping heat that spread from his palm up his wrist like invisible fire, and when he held it up to the light, he could see something beneath his skin, a mark that looked almost like a brand, silver lines forming a pattern he didn't recognize and couldn't understand. The sirens were 2 blocks away now, maybe less, and Marcus shoved the locket into his pocket and ran, his work boots splashing through puddles and his breath coming in ragged gasps. And he didn't stop running until he was 6 blocks away, in an alley behind a closed restaurant, bent over with his hands on his knees, trying not to vomit. He straightened slowly, his whole body shaking, and pulled out the locket with fingers that felt numb and distant, turning it over in the dim light from a distant street lamp. Ornate silver, old in a way that felt deliberate, and when he opened it, he found a photograph inside, faded and delicate, showing two infants with pale eyes and identical faces, and an inscription in a language he didn't know, though the numbers were clear enough: 1678. His hand throbbed in rhythm with his heartbeat, the mark pulsing with each surge of blood, and Marcus looked at it with growing horror because he could feel it now, really feel it. Something alive and aware coiled beneath his skin, binding him to a secret he didn't understand, and a dead woman's final desperate wish. He thought about his sister, about Emma's face 5 years ago, when the drunk driver's car had spun into her lane and he'd been too slow, too late, too human to save her. About how he'd quit the ambulance service the next day because he couldn't stand holding any more lives in his hands, knowing how easily they slipped away. About how he'd chosen invisibility and safety and the small, predictable world of night shift custodial work, where the worst thing that could happen was a backed up toilet or a spill in the cafeteria. But this woman, this Irina Volkov with her impossible strength and her two long canines and her blood that burned like acid, had seen him in that parking lot and chosen him, marked him, bound him to something he couldn't run from no matter how fast he moved, and the thought made him want to scream. He tried rubbing at the mark on his hand, but it only burned hotter, the silver lines glowing faintly in the dark, and he realized with sick certainty that this wasn't going away, that he couldn't wash it off or cut it out or pretend it never happened, that he was marked now in a way that went deeper than skin. In the distance he could hear more sirens, and he wondered if they'd found the body yet, if they were already looking for the man who'd been seen running from the scene, and he pulled his jacket tighter and started walking, his mind racing through options that all led to the same conclusion. He was in this now, whatever this was, and the only way out was through. The locket felt heavy in his pocket, the dead woman's final words echoing in his head like a curse. 72 hours until they smell me on you. Don't let him find her. He's killed thousands to bury the truth. Marcus didn't know who Kieran was, or what throne the woman had been talking about, or why her daughter needed hiding. But he knew death when he saw it, and he knew desperation, and he knew the look in someone's eyes when they were entrusting you with the one thing that mattered most. And Emma had looked at him the same way in those final seconds before the car hit, like he was supposed to save her, like he was supposed to know what to do. He'd failed her. The thought sat in his chest like a stone, cold and immovable. This time, he thought, looking at the glowing mark on his hand, and the locket in his palm, and the rain falling soft and relentless around him, this time maybe he wouldn't fail. It was a stupid thought, dangerous and naive, the kind of thought that got people killed, but it settled into his bones anyway, stubborn and immovable, and as he walked through the wet Portland streets toward his apartment, Marcus Webb made a choice. He would find the girl in the forest house. He would keep her safe from whoever Kieran was, and he would not run. Not this time. Not when a dying woman had looked at him with those ice-pale eyes and trusted him with her daughter's life, even if it killed him. Marcus made it back to his studio apartment at 2:14 a.m., his hands still shaking as he locked the door and checked it twice, then a third time, because paranoia felt reasonable when you'd just watched a woman with fangs die in a parking lot, and the place looked exactly as he'd left it 6 hours ago, cramped and sparse, one room with a kitchenette and a bathroom the size of a closet. A mattress on the floor and milk crates for furniture, the kind of deliberate poverty that came from wanting to leave no traces, to be forgettable, to live so small that when you disappeared, no one would notice the absence. He turned on every light and sat at the card table that served as his desk, pulling out the locket with careful fingers, because the mark on his hand was still burning. A slow, steady heat that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. And in the apartment's harsh overhead light, he could see the silver lines more clearly now. Intricate patterns that looked almost like writing, curling from his palm up toward his wrist in delicate spirals that made his skin crawl. The locket was heavier than it should be for its size. Old silver tarnished dark, except where the woman's blood had cleaned it, and when he opened it again, the photograph inside seemed even more fragile. Two infants with identical faces and pale, pale eyes, the kind of pale that looked almost colorless, and the inscription on the opposite side read K and A, 1678, the numbers rendered in a flowing script that had to be 300 years old if the date was real. He turned it over and over in his hands, looking for answers, but the locket kept its secrets, and his hand kept burning. And at 2:47 a.m. his phone lit up with a text from a number he didn't recognize. The Glass Citadel, 9 a.m., alone, you touched what belonged to the king. Marcus stared at the message until the screen went dark, then threw the phone across the room where it hit the wall and clattered to the floor, and he put his head in his hands and tried to think. The smart move was to run, take the Greyhound to Seattle or San Francisco or anywhere that wasn't here. But when he stood up and grabbed his coat and headed for the door, the mark on his hand flared hot enough to make him gasp. And by the time he made it down to the street and started walking toward the bus station, the heat had become pain, bright and sharp, and getting worse with every step, until he was 6 blocks from his apartment, and the pain was so intense he couldn't breathe, and he had to turn around. The relief was immediate, the burning subsiding to a tolerable warmth as he walked back the way he'd come. And Marcus understood with sick certainty that he was trapped, that the mark wasn't just a brand, but a leash, binding him to Portland and whatever the dead woman had chosen him to protect. He went back upstairs and spent the hours until dawn researching on his laptop, searching for Irina Volkov, Glass Citadel, Guardian marks, vampires, anything that might explain what was happening, and what he found made the fear in his chest solidify into something cold and immovable. Irina Volkov was real. Philanthropist, art collector, reclusive billionaire who'd lived in Portland for 40 years and donated millions to hospitals and museums and historic preservation. Her face appearing in exactly 3 photographs, always at charity galas, always slightly out of focus, as if she'd moved just as the shutter clicked. And she had a son, Kieran Volkov, who was listed as CEO of a tech conglomerate Marcus had never heard of, but which apparently owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Portland. There was only one photo of Kieran, a press release from 5 years ago, and Marcus stared at it until his eyes burned. A man who looked maybe 30, dark hair and winter-pale skin, and eyes that looked through the camera like he was seeing something miles beyond it. Sharp cheekbones and a mouth that might have been beautiful if it wasn't set in such a cold line. And the resemblance to the infant in the locket was unmistakable. The same bone structure, the same unsettling eyes. At 6:30 a.m., Marcus turned on the news, and there it was, breaking story. Irina Volkov found dead in St. Mercy Hospital parking lot. Police investigating. Son has not commented. And they showed the same photo of Kieran looking remote and untouchable, and Marcus thought, he's killed thousands to bury the truth. That's what she said. And looking at those eyes, he believed it. He showered and put on the cleanest clothes he owned, jeans and a button-down shirt that was only slightly wrinkled, and looked at himself in the bathroom mirror and saw a man who'd spent 5 years trying to disappear, staring back, 34 years old but looking older. The kind of worn down that came from grief and guilt and too many night shifts. And he thought about not going, about ignoring the text and staying in his apartment until the mark burned him alive or they came to drag him out. But he'd made a choice in that alley last night, and he was apparently too stubborn or too stupid to unmake it. The Glass Citadel was downtown, a 15-minute walk from his apartment, and Marcus had passed it 100 times without really seeing it. A renovated 1920s bank, all Art Deco lines and modern glass. The kind of building that looked like it cost more per square foot than he made in a year, and when he walked through the main doors at exactly 9 a.m., the lobby took his breath away. Everything was mirrors and steel and cold white light. the ceiling soaring 3 stories overhead, the floor polished marble that reflected his scuffed boots and made him look small and out of place. And there were people moving through the space with the kind of deliberate grace that didn't look quite human. Men and women in tailored suits and designer dresses, all of them pale, all of them moving just slightly too smoothly. And Marcus felt every eye turn toward him as he stood there dripping rain onto their pristine floor. A woman approached, tall and elegant in a black dress that probably cost more than his car, and she smiled at him with teeth that had been filed to points, not even trying to hide what she was, and she said nothing, just gestured for him to follow. They took an elevator to the top floor, the silence so complete Marcus could hear his own heartbeat thudding against his ribs, and the woman's reflection in the mirrored elevator walls was slightly wrong, slightly translucent, there but not quite solid, and Marcus kept his eyes on the floor numbers ticking upward, because looking at her made his head hurt. The top floor was one massive office, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Portland's rain-soaked skyline. And the man sitting behind the black glass desk was Kieran Volkov, and he was perfectly still in a way that living things shouldn't be. No fidgeting or breathing or unconscious movement, just absolute controlled immobility. And when he looked up at Marcus, his eyes were the same pale gray as his mother's, the same pale gray as the infant's in the locket, and Marcus felt the mark on his hand flare with recognition. Kieran said nothing for a long moment, just studied Marcus with an intensity that felt like being dissected. And then, "You were the last person to touch my mother. Her scent is all over you. Tell me what she said." His voice was quiet and controlled and absolutely certain. And Marcus opened his mouth to lie, to say he'd just found her already dead. He didn't know anything. But the mark on his hand ignited with heat so intense, he gasped, and the words died in his throat, choking him. And Kieran's expression shifted, something like understanding flickering across his face before the mask of control slammed back down. "She marked you," Kieran said, leaning forward slightly. "A guardian bind. That means she trusted you with something I'm not allowed to know." And his voice had dropped to barely a whisper, dangerous and fascinated. What did she hide from me? Marcus tried to hold the words back, but they came anyway, forced out by the mark's compulsion. "She said you'd kill to keep the throne." The temperature in the room dropped so fast Marcus could see his breath, and Kieran stood, moving with that inhuman grace, and walked to the window, his reflection sharp in the glass, multiple versions of him appearing in the mirrored walls, and when he spoke his voice was still perfectly controlled. She wasn't wrong. Marcus felt the fear spike cold in his chest, but he stood his ground because running wasn't an option anymore. Literally. And Kieran turned back to face him with something almost like amusement in those pale eyes. "Guardian marks are old-world magic," he said, stepping closer. "Unbreakable. You can't lie to me about what she protected. You can't run, and if you try to tell anyone else, the mark will stop your heart. So we're bound now, you and I. Isn't that cozy?" He leaned in close enough that Marcus could smell ozone and old paper and something metallic, and Marcus forced himself not to flinch. "I didn't ask for this," he said, and Kieran laughed, sharp and bitter. "Neither did I, but my mother chose you, which means you're either incredibly trustworthy or incredibly expendable. We have 72 hours to find out which." He walked back to his desk and sat down, that perfect stillness returning, and gestured to a chair across from him. "Sit. We have things to discuss." And Marcus sat, because what else was he going to do? And looked at the vampire king who'd killed thousands, and thought about the locket in his pocket, and the secret he was bound to protect, and wondered which of them would break first. The office was silent, except for the faint sound of rain against the windows, and Marcus could see himself reflected in every mirrored surface, small and human, and utterly out of his depth. And Kieran watched him with those predator eyes and said, "Tell me everything she said, every word, and leave nothing out." And Marcus felt the mark compel him to speak, and realized with horrible clarity that he had no choice, that the binding worked both ways, That he was trapped in this room with this creature who looked at him like a problem to be solved or eliminated, and all he could do was talk. So he did. The negotiation took hours, Marcus sitting in that mirrored office while Kieran circled him like a predator, trying to determine if the prey was worth the effort, asking questions in that controlled, quiet voice, probing for weaknesses, testing the limits of what the Guardian mark would and wouldn't compel Marcus to reveal. And Marcus learned that the mark worked in strange ways. He couldn't lie directly about the secret, but he could refuse to answer, could stay silent even as the heat built in his palm. And the pain was bearable if he focused on Emma's face, on the promise he'd made to a dying woman in a parking lot. And eventually, Kieran stopped asking and started bargaining. Protection from court scrutiny in exchange for the truth. A temporary alliance until they could determine what Irina had actually hidden and why. And Marcus agreed because what choice did he have, trapped in this city by magic he didn't understand, bound to a secret that might get him killed? And besides, he thought, looking at Kieran's carefully controlled face, the Vampire King wanted to know what his mother had hidden from him badly enough to negotiate with a human janitor, which meant Marcus had more leverage than either of them was comfortable with. At 4 p.m., Kieran made a phone call, 3 words in a language Marcus didn't recognize, and 20 minutes later, a black car pulled up to the Citadel's underground garage, driver silent behind tinted windows. And Kieran said, "Show me." So Marcus pulled out the locket and watched Kieran's expression fracture for just a moment when he saw the photograph, 2 infants with identical pale eyes, before the mask slammed back into place. The inscription, Marcus said, pointing to the engraved letters, K and A, 1678, your mother said the forest house, cedar and glass, and Kieran took the locket with careful fingers and stared at it like it might explode. And when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than Marcus had heard it. I had a sister. She was stillborn. My mother told me she died the same day we were born. And Marcus watched him turn the locket over and over in his hands, and thought about what it must be like to discover your entire history was a lie. They drove east into the Cascade foothills, 90 minutes of tense silence broken only by the sound of rain on the car's roof and the occasional direction from Marcus, who was navigating from half-remembered fragments of what Irina had whispered. Forest roads, old-growth cedars, a house that looked like it grew from the trees themselves, and the mark on his hand grew warmer the closer they got. A compass pointing toward whatever he was bound to protect. And when they finally turned onto an unmarked gravel road that wound through massive cedars, Marcus knew they were close. The house appeared through the trees like something from a dream, exactly as Irina had described. Cedar siding weathered silver gray, walls of glass that glowed golden in the gathering twilight, a stone chimney sending up thin smoke that smelled like applewood, and it was surrounded by old-growth forest so thick that the rain fell in gentle drips from the canopy overhead, instead of the harsh downpour they'd driven through. And through the windows, Marcus could see a young woman moving around a kitchen, mid-20s maybe, dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, and she was cooking something, laughing at something on her phone, completely ordinary and completely unaware. Kieran got out of the car slowly, moving like he was in a dream or a nightmare, and Marcus followed, watching the Vampire King's face as he stared at the house, at the woman visible through the lit windows. And Marcus saw the exact moment Kieran recognized her. His whole body went rigid, his hand reaching out to grip the nearest tree like he needed something solid to keep him upright. And his voice when he spoke was barely audible over the sound of rain dripping through branches. That's impossible. My sister died, 1678, stillborn. My mother held her body and wept, and we buried her in the family crypt. I was there. Marcus pulled out the locket again, opened it, held it where Kieran could see the photograph. 2 infants, he said quietly, and Kieran took it with shaking hands, and Marcus watched 300 years of certainty shatter across his face, like glass breaking. My mother told me I was the only one, Kieran said, his voice hollow. The only heir. The court would never have accepted me if they knew there was another option. If they knew the bloodline had split. And he stopped, pressed his palm against the cedar tree, hard enough that bark cracked under his fingers. She hid my sister for 300 years. She let me think I was alone. She built everything on that lie. Inside the house, the woman set down her phone and stirred something on the stove, humming, and Marcus could see Kieran's bone structure in her face, Irina's coloring in her dark hair, and she moved with easy human grace, no supernatural stillness, no predatory awareness, just a normal woman making dinner in her warm house while rain fell soft around her. And Marcus thought, she has no idea what she is, no idea what's at stake. Kieran's expression was shifting, the shock giving way to something colder, more calculating, and Marcus felt his stomach drop because he recognized that look. He'd seen it in the glass citadel when Kieran had said his mother wasn't wrong about him killing to keep the throne. "If the court learns I have a living sister," Kieran said slowly, still staring at the house, "they'll declare the succession invalid. They'll say my mother lied about the bloodline, corrupted the inheritance. They'll execute her to erase the evidence and install someone else, someone from one of the elder families who've been waiting centuries for the Volkovs to show weakness." And he turned to look at Marcus with those pale predator eyes. "You understand what I have to do." Marcus stepped between Kieran and the house, his heart hammering but his feet planted firm, and said, "You're not touching her." And Kieran's eyes flashed red, actual glowing red like embers in the twilight, and he said, "She's a threat to everything I've built." And Marcus shot back, "She's your sister." And Kieran laughed, sharp and bitter. "I don't have a sister. I have a throne." The mark on Marcus's hand ignited with heat so intense he gasped, dropping to one knee, and Kieran's expression changed, the anger replaced by something like understanding, and he crouched down beside Marcus, studying the glowing silver lines on his palm with fascinated horror. "The mark is tied to her life," Kieran said slowly. "If I kill her, it kills you." And he laughed again, softer this time, almost admiring. "My mother's final play. She made sure I couldn't erase this without blood on my hands. I'd actually regret. She knew me well enough to know I wouldn't care about killing a stranger, but she gambled that I'd care about killing the man she chose to trust, the man she bound to her daughter's survival, clever, vicious, exactly like her." Marcus pushed himself back to his feet, the pain in his hand subsiding but not disappearing. And he looked at Kieran and saw something raw and broken beneath the cold mask, saw a man who'd just discovered his entire identity was built on lies, and he said quietly, "Do you know what it takes to hold a vampire court together?" And Kieran's voice was hard. "Blood and fear and absolute certainty. I am the king because I am the only heir. Take that away, and I'm just another predator with a crown, just another monster playing at civilization." And Marcus felt something twist in his chest, because he heard the truth beneath the words, heard the fear and the loneliness and the desperate need for control, and he said, "Then maybe you shouldn't be king." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain and the woman's humming from inside the house, and Kieran stood perfectly still, his reflection sharp in the house's glass walls. And when he finally spoke, his voice was raw. "You don't understand what you're asking me to give up. I've spent 3 centuries building this, maintaining the peace, keeping the old families from tearing each other apart, and without the absolute certainty of my right to rule, it all falls apart. Humans die. Vampires die. Everything my mother sacrificed for, everything I've killed for, it all becomes meaningless." Marcus thought about Emma, about the sister he'd lost because he'd been too slow and too human, about 5 years of running from responsibility and danger, and he looked at this vampire king who was contemplating murdering his own sister to keep power, and he felt anger burn through the fear. "I'm not asking," he said. "I'm telling you, you're not killing her. Find another way." And Kieran's eyes flashed red again, but Marcus didn't step back, didn't look away, and something in Kieran's expression cracked. They stood there in the gathering dark, 50 feet from the house where Kieran's sister lived in warm, oblivious safety, and Marcus watched the Vampire King struggle with a choice that should have been simple, that would have been simple for anyone with a shred of humanity left. And he realized with cold clarity that Kieran might actually do it, might actually choose power over family, might kill his own sister and Marcus too just to keep the throne, and the mark burned steady and hot against his palm like it was trying to tell him something, like it was saying, "This is the moment. This is where everything changes. Choose carefully." Inside the house, the woman turned off the stove and carried her pot to the table, still humming, and Marcus thought, she deserves to know, deserves to understand what she is and what danger she's in, deserves better than to die because her mother kept secrets and her brother values a crown more than blood. And he opened his mouth to say so when Kieran finally moved, turning away from the house, his shoulders tight with tension, and when he spoke his voice was quiet and defeated. "We go back. We don't tell her anything yet. We figure out how to protect her without destroying everything else." And Marcus felt the mark's heat subside slightly, like it approved of the temporary reprieve, and he nodded because it was better than the alternative, better than standing here and watching Kieran make the wrong choice. They got back in the car without speaking, and as they pulled away, Marcus looked back at the house one more time, at the warm lights and the woman visible through the windows, safe for now, ignorant for now, and he thought, I'm not letting you kill her. I don't care what it costs me. I already failed one sister. I'm not failing another. And beside him, Kieran sat rigid and silent, staring out at the dark forest rushing past. And Marcus wondered if the Vampire King was thinking the same thing, if some small part of him that remembered being human was fighting against 3 centuries of ruthless calculation, if maybe, just maybe, there was enough humanity left in him to choose differently. They drove back to Portland in silence so thick it felt suffocating, Marcus watching the dark forest give way to highway lights and then city streets, Kieran sitting rigid beside him, and neither of them spoke until the car pulled into the Citadel's underground garage, and Kieran said without looking at him, "You're staying here, secure wing, for protection." And Marcus knew it was house arrest, but he also knew he didn't have a choice, so he followed the silent escort through mirrored hallways to a room that looked like a luxury hotel suite. If luxury hotel suites had no windows, and surveillance cameras in every corner, and doors that locked from the outside. The room had expensive furniture and soft lighting and everything he could possibly need except freedom, and Marcus sat on the edge of the bed and put his head in his hands and thought about the woman in the forest house, about Anna, about how she'd looked so peaceful cooking dinner in her warm kitchen, completely unaware that her existence was a death sentence. And the mark on his palm pulsed steady and insistent like it was reminding him, this is what you're bound to protect, this is why you can't run, this is the choice you made in that parking lot 3 nights ago. He tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emma's face the moment before the car hit, saw Irina dying on wet pavement, saw Kieran's expression when he'd realized his sister was alive, that terrible moment of shock and grief and calculation. And at 8 a.m., when someone brought him breakfast on a tray, he ate without tasting anything and wondered what the hell he was supposed to do now. At 10 a.m., he heard voices in the hallway outside his room, Kieran's controlled tone, and someone else, a woman's voice that sounded like silk over steel, and Marcus pressed his ear to the door and caught fragments. Unusual death, poison that stops healing, very sophisticated, very deliberate, and then, "I've heard you're distracted by a human, Kieran," the court has noticed, and Kieran's response too quiet to hear, but the woman laughed, cold and sharp. When the voices faded, Marcus tried the door and found it unlocked, so he followed the sound of footsteps and found Kieran standing alone in his office, staring out at the rain-soaked city. And when Marcus entered, Kieran didn't turn around. "That was Elder Cassia," he said, his voice flat. 600 years old, council member, one of the old families who've been waiting for the Volkovs to show weakness since before I was born. She came to offer condolences that felt like threats. The succession vote is tomorrow at midnight. The court expects clarity. No loose ends. Your mother kept too many secrets. You are not your mother, and he finally turned to face Marcus. They know something is wrong. If they find out about my sister before I can secure my position, they'll move against both of us, against all three of us. Marcus felt the anger rise hot in his chest and said, "Then tell her, get her to safety, she deserves to know what's coming," and Kieran's expression hardened. She's human, she's lived a normal life. Telling her she's a vampire's twin will either get her killed or destroy that life. Either way, she loses. We protect her by keeping her ignorant. They argued for an hour, Marcus insisting Anna had a right to the truth, Kieran maintaining that ignorance was the only real protection he could offer, and it went nowhere. Both of them talking past each other until Marcus was exhausted and furious, and Kieran looked like he hadn't slept in days. And finally, Marcus went back to his gilded cage and sat in the silence and thought about choices and consequences and the ways people convinced themselves that lies were kindness. At 9 p.m., he pulled out his phone and realized he still had service, that Kieran hadn't thought to confiscate it, or maybe had chosen not to, and he pulled up the number he'd gotten from directory assistance that afternoon, A. Volkov, Forest Route, and he called before he could talk himself out of it. The phone rang 3 times, and then a woman's voice answered, warm and slightly confused. "Hello?" Marcus took a breath and said, "Is this Anna?" And she said, "Yes, who is this?" And he said, "My name is Marcus. You don't know me. But I need you to be careful. Lock your doors. Don't trust strangers." And there was a long pause before she said, "Is this some kind of prank?" And Marcus said, "I wish it was. I can't explain everything right now, but please, just be careful." And her voice when she responded was quieter, more serious. "Are you in trouble? Do you need help?" And Marcus felt something crack in his chest at the kindness in those words, at the fact that a stranger's first instinct was to offer help instead of hang up. He said, "Just promise me you'll be careful." And she said, "Okay, I promise." And then after a pause, "Thank you for warning me, whoever you are." And Marcus hung up before he could say anything else he'd regret. He turned around and Kieran was standing in the doorway, perfectly silent, and his expression was unreadable. "You had no right," Kieran said, his voice tight with controlled fury, and Marcus shot back. "She has a right to know someone's looking out for her," and Kieran's control cracked, his voice rising. "I've spent 300 years looking out for her without her knowing I existed. My mother told me she died, and I mourned her. I mourned a sister I never got to know. Do you know what it does to find out you've been mourning a lie? To discover that everything you were told about your own history was carefully constructed fiction?" He turned to the window, his reflection sharp in the glass, multiple versions of him visible in the mirrored walls. And when he spoke again, his voice was raw. "I don't know how to be someone's brother. I don't know how to let people in. My mother taught me that love is a liability. Every ally is a future enemy. I've ruled that way for 300 years. Marcus said quietly, "And you're fucking miserable." And Kieran laughed, bitter and broken. "Yes." They stood there in silence, Marcus watching Kieran's reflection in the window, seeing all the cracks in his carefully constructed control, and Marcus thought about loneliness, about the different ways people built walls to survive, and he said, "Start by not killing her. That's a good first step." And Kieran's shoulders shook with something that might have been laughter or might have been grief. At 2 a.m., the alarm started screaming, loud enough to wake the entire building, and Marcus stumbled out of his room to find Kieran already in the hallway, moving with that inhuman speed, and he said, "Lower levels, someone's breached the vaults," and Marcus followed him down, down. Down through cold stone corridors that smelled like dust and iron and old money, emergency lights casting everything in harsh red, and when they reached the vault level, the heavy door was standing open, steel torn like paper, and inside the rows of filing cabinets one drawer was empty, its contents scattered across the floor except for one file that was simply gone. Kieran went still in that way that meant he was thinking fast, and none of it was good. and he picked up a note that had been pinned to the empty drawer with a knife, and Marcus read over his shoulder. 1678, twins. The court will know by dawn, written in what looked like blood, still wet and gleaming under the emergency lights. Cassia, Kieran said, his voice flat and certain. She's forcing the reveal to destabilize me before the vote. She must have known or suspected. She's been waiting for an opportunity like this for decades, and he crumpled the note in his fist. We have less than 24 hours, Marcus said. Then we tell them first, control the narrative, get ahead of it, and Kieran shook his head. If I admit I've known and hidden her, they'll see it as weakness and deception. If I claim I just found out, they'll question why my mother lied and whether my entire line is corrupt. Either way, I lose. And Marcus finished for him. Either way, you lose the throne, but maybe Anna lives. Kieran looked at him like he was seeing something he'd never noticed before, his pale eyes searching Marcus's face, and he said, "Why do you care? You didn't ask for this. The mark makes you protect her, but you're choosing to protect me too. Why?" Marcus thought about Emma, about the sister he'd lost because he'd been too slow and too human and too fucking useless, about 5 years of running from responsibility and danger and the weight of other people's lives, and he said, "Because I know what it's like to lose family and do nothing, I won't do that again." The silence that followed felt heavy and significant, and Kieran's expression shifted through emotions too fast for Marcus to track before settling on something that looked almost like wonder, almost like fear, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet. "I've killed for less than what you just did. Contacting her without permission is a direct violation of every agreement we made." And Marcus said, "Human decency. Yeah, try it sometime." Dawn was starting to creep through the Citadel's glass walls, pale gray light that made everything look washed out and fragile, and they stood in the violated vault surrounded by 3 centuries of carefully kept secrets. And Kieran said, "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to choose her over the throne. I don't know how to trust that there's another way." And Marcus heard the truth beneath the words, heard the desperate plea for someone to show him that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that connection wasn't suicide, that maybe after 300 years of isolation, he could choose differently. Back in Anna's forest house, she was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, watching dawn light filter through the cedars, thinking about the strange phone call from the man named Marcus, who'd warned her to be careful, and she felt that old familiar loneliness stir in her chest, the sense that she'd always been slightly out of place in the world, slightly disconnected from everyone around her, like she was missing something fundamental that everyone else seemed to have, and the stranger's concern had touched something deep and aching, had made her feel seen in a way she couldn't quite explain. She didn't know why she trusted him, didn't know what danger he was warning her about, but she locked her doors anyway and made a mental note to be more cautious. And she looked at her reflection in the window glass and wondered not for the first time if there was something about her that drew trouble, something she couldn't see, but others could. And she finished her tea and tried to shake off the unease. In the Citadel, Marcus and Kieran returned to Kieran's office and sat across from each other as the city woke up around them, and Kieran said, "The succession vote is tonight at midnight. The council will convene in the ceremonial hall, all 12 elders. If Cassia reveals what she knows before I can find a way to protect my sister, then everything falls apart." And Marcus said, "So we find a way. We have 18 hours. And Kieran laughed, exhausted and almost genuine. "You make it sound simple." And Marcus said, "It is simple. You choose her, you choose family over power. The rest is just details." They spent the day planning, arguing, trying to find a scenario where everyone survived and the court didn't tear itself apart. And Marcus watched Kieran's careful control unravel bit by bit as the reality of the situation sank in, watched him pace and calculate, and finally just sit with his head in his hands. And Marcus thought, he's terrified. He's spent 3 centuries building this perfect controlled existence, and it's all coming apart, and he doesn't know how to be anything except the king. And something in Marcus's chest tightened because he recognized that fear, that desperate clinging to identity even when the identity was killing you. At noon, Kieran looked at him and said, "If this goes wrong, if they come for her, promise me you'll get her out, get her somewhere safe, use the mark if you have to, make her run." And Marcus said, "I promise." And Kieran nodded once, sharp and final. And Marcus realized they'd just made a pact, that Kieran was trusting him with the one thing that mattered more than the throne, even if he couldn't admit it yet. The hours crawled past, the mark on Marcus's hand pulsing steady like a heartbeat. And as midnight approached, they prepared for the succession vote, knowing that whatever happened in the next few hours would change everything, would either save Anna or condemn them all. And Marcus looked at Kieran across the office and thought, he's finally choosing humanity over power. He just doesn't know it yet. Kieran stood in the ceremonial hall at 10:30 p.m. and felt the weight of 3 centuries pressing down on his shoulders. The room unchanged since 1874. Circular stone walls covered in silver mirrors that reflected and multiplied everything until it was impossible to tell how many people were really present. And the air smelled like old incense and older stone, and the faint metallic tang of blood that had soaked into the floor over hundreds of years of vampire politics. The 12 elders sat in a semicircle, ancient predators in expensive suits, and Kieran recognized every face, knew every alliance and grudge and ambition, had spent decades learning to read them and anticipate them and stay 3 moves ahead. And now he stood at the center of their scrutiny, knowing that everything he'd built was balanced on a knife's edge. Marcus stood against the wall as witness, the guardian mark his only credential, and Kieran could feel the human's steady presence like an anchor, like something solid in a world that had become suddenly unstable. And he thought, he shouldn't be here. He should have run the moment I gave him the chance. But he stayed. He's choosing to stay. And that choice meant something Kieran didn't have time to examine. Elder Cassia rose at precisely 11 p.m., 600 years old and beautiful in the way that apex predators were beautiful, all sharp edges and cold certainty, and she opened with the traditional formalities, honoring Irina's memory and legacy, speaking of continuity and tradition and the sacred trust of leadership. And Kieran listened with half his attention, while the other half calculated exit strategies and damage control scenarios and ways this could go catastrophically wrong. Then Cassia struck, her voice cutting through the ceremonial pleasantries like a blade. "Before we confirm succession, the court has discovered evidence of a complication in the Volkov bloodline." And she gestured to the mirrored walls where suddenly images appeared, projected from somewhere. Irina's private records spread across every reflective surface. Birth certificates, medical files, photographs, 2 infants with identical pale eyes, and Anna's current address printed in stark black letters. The room erupted, voices overlapping in outrage and accusation, and Kieran heard the words. Hiding an heir, lying to the court, weakness, deception, compromise, and he stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos, watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time, watching 300 years of control evaporate like smoke. Cassia let the noise build before raising her hand for silence, and when she spoke again, her voice was silk over steel. Kieran Volkov has hidden the existence of a living heir, his twin sister, fully human, a dilution of our bloodline, and a betrayal of the court's trust. And she paused to let that sink in before continuing. I call for Anna Volkov's immediate retrieval and execution to preserve the integrity of the line. The girl is a liability we cannot afford. Kieran felt something cold and final settle in his chest, felt the old familiar calculations start. How to minimize damage, how to keep the throne, how to survive this with his power intact. And the answer was simple, brutal, obvious. Sacrifice Anna, claim ignorance, blame his mother's deception, turn this into an opportunity to demonstrate strength and decisiveness. And he opened his mouth to do exactly that when he caught Marcus's eyes across the room. The human was watching him with an expression Kieran couldn't quite read, something between hope and horror, like he was witnessing a choice being made in real time and couldn't look away. And Kieran thought about the forest house, about Anna cooking dinner in warm golden light, about Marcus stepping between them and saying, "You're not touching her," about 300 years of loneliness and the terrible weight of being the only one, always the only one, and he thought, "I'm so fucking tired of being alone." He stood, and the room fell silent, every predator eye fixed on him, waiting to see which way he would break, and Kieran said, "My mother hid my sister to protect her from exactly this. Anna is human. She poses no threat to any of you. She doesn't even know what she is." Cassia's smile was thin and triumphant. "Then she's a liability. Human bloodlines dilute our power. Your mother's deception proves the Volkov line is compromised. Step down, Kieran. Let the court choose new leadership. Someone whose loyalty isn't divided between crown and family." Kieran felt the calculation still running in the back of his mind, looking for the angle, the play that saved everything, the way to keep both the throne and his sister. And he knew Marcus was watching him, knew this was the moment that would define everything that came after. And the old Kieran, the king his mother had shaped over 3 centuries, would choose power, would sacrifice Anna without hesitation, would prove his fitness to rule through ruthless pragmatism. He reached up and pulled the signet ring from his finger, the mark of kingship, heavy gold and ancient, and he set it on the stone table with a sound that echoed in the sudden silence. "I won't trade my sister's life for a crown," he said, his voice steady despite the way his hands wanted to shake. "If that makes me unfit to rule, so be it." The silence that followed felt like the moment before an execution, total and absolute, and Kieran watched his own reflection in the mirrored walls, saw himself multiplied a dozen times, all of them looking small and exposed without the ring, and he thought, "I just gave up everything, 300 years of power gone in a single choice," and the terror was almost overwhelming, but underneath it was something else, something that felt almost like relief. Cassia recovered first, reaching for the ring with fingers that didn't quite hide their eagerness. "The court accepts your abdication," and then Marcus's voice cut through the room, sharp and certain. "The guardian mark is tied to Anna's life. If you kill her, you kill me. And the mark doesn't end with my death. It passes to the next protector. Kill me, and it marks one of you. You'll spend eternity hunting guardians." Kieran saw the bluff immediately, saw the way Marcus's jaw was set, and his conviction absolute despite the fact that he had no idea if any of what he was saying was true. And Elder Thorne asked, "Is this accurate?" And Kieran met Marcus's eyes across the room and saw the desperate gamble there. Saw the human putting everything on the line for a woman he'd never met, and a vampire king who'd given him nothing but trouble, and Kieran made a choice. "Yes," he said, turning to face the council. "My mother bound the secret to an eternal chain. Anna's death triggers a cascade you can't contain. She made sure that killing my sister would cost more than any of you are willing to pay. It was a lie, complete and obvious to anyone who knew Guardian Mark mechanics. But Marcus's conviction had sold it, and Kieran's confirmation sealed it, and he watched the elders exchange glances, calculating risk versus reward, and Cassia's expression went cold. "We need to consult precedent. A recess, 30 minutes." And the council dispersed, leaving Kieran and Marcus alone in the mirrored hall. "That was a dangerous bluff," Kieran said, and Marcus shrugged. "It worked," and Kieran almost laughed. "For now, they'll figure out we're lying, and when they do," and he didn't finish because the glass doors shattered inward, exploding in a spray of crystal, and Anna stood in the doorway flanked by 2 of Cassia's enforcers, and she was terrified and furious and alive. "Someone wants to explain why I was dragged from my home by strangers who say I'm the Vampire King's secret sister," she said, her voice shaking but her chin up. Defiant, and Kieran felt 300 years of grief and love and terror crash over him all at once, because there she was, his sister, his twin, the other half of himself that he'd mourned for centuries, and he couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only stare. Marcus stepped forward. Anna, I'm Marcus. We spoke on the phone. I'm sorry it happened this way, but you're in danger. These people want you dead because you're living proof their world isn't as pure as they claim. And Anna's eyes found Kieran. You're my brother? 3 centuries of practiced control, of carefully constructed walls, of ruling through fear and absolute certainty, and Kieran's voice broke when he finally managed to speak. I thought you were dead. For 300 years I thought I was alone. Anna's anger cracked, her expression shifting to something softer, more vulnerable, and she took a step closer. I've always felt like I didn't quite fit, like I was missing something, and she looked at him with eyes that were a mirror of his own, the same pale gray, the same sharp intelligence, and she asked, Are you really? And Kieran said, I'm real, you're real, and I will not let them hurt you. The council returned, Cassia at the front, and she said, We've reached a decision. Anna Volkov will submit to a binding ritual that strips her of any claim to vampire lineage. In exchange, Kieran may retain the throne. Anna lives, but only as a severed branch, and Marcus asked what that meant, and another elder explained with clinical precision. The ritual burns out any trace of vampire heritage from her human blood. It's agonizing but not fatal. She'll be completely, irrevocably human afterward. No claim to succession, no threat to the bloodline. Anna looked at Kieran. Will it keep me safe? And he couldn't speak past the horror in his throat, so he just nodded, and Anna said, Then I'll do it. And Kieran's composure shattered. No, I won't let them. I'll find another way. But Anna took his hand, her grip warm and human, and impossibly brave. I've lived 25 years without knowing you existed. If this buys us a chance to know each other, it's worth it. They brought in the ritual implements, ancient silver and carved bone, and Anna knelt in the center of the circle, while Cassia spoke words in a language older than Latin. And when the magic ignited, Anna screamed, a sound that echoed off stone and glass, and multiplied in the mirrors until it felt like 100 people screaming. And Marcus grabbed her hand and held on while she convulsed, and Kieran watched helpless as his sister suffered for a bloodline she'd never asked to be part of, for a heritage she'd lived her entire life not knowing she had. The ritual lasted 7 minutes that felt like hours, and when it was over, Anna collapsed, unconscious but breathing, and the mark on Marcus's hand had faded to a faint silver scar, barely visible. And Kieran felt the guardian bond sever like a string snapping, felt Anna become just human, just his sister, no longer a political secret but a person, fragile and mortal and his. Cassia smiled, cold and satisfied. Succession confirmed, long live the king, and the council intoned the words back, and Kieran looked at Anna unconscious on the stone floor, at Marcus cradling her head and checking her pulse, with the efficient movements of someone who'd done medical training, at the elders who'd twisted his choice into submission and called it mercy, and he thought, You think this is over? It's not. I chose family over power, and you made me pay for it in blood. But I'm still king, and now I have nothing left to lose. He met Cassia's eyes and said it aloud. You think this is over, it's not. And her smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered, and Kieran knew he'd made an enemy for life, but he didn't care because Anna was alive, and Marcus was holding her like she mattered, and dawn was breaking through the high windows, pale light making everything look washed out and new. They carried Anna to Kieran's office, Marcus refusing to leave her side, and Kieran sat across from them and watched his sister breathe, her face peaceful in unconsciousness. And he thought about his mother's final gift, about how she'd bound a stranger to protect the daughter she'd hidden, about how she'd trusted a human janitor with the secret that could destroy everything Kieran had built. And maybe, just maybe, she'd known exactly what she was doing. Maybe she'd known that Kieran needed someone like Marcus, someone who would stand between him and his worst instincts and refuse to move, someone who would show him that vulnerability wasn't weakness and connection wasn't suicide, someone who would protect his sister even when it meant defying a vampire king. Anna stirred, her eyes opening slowly, and she looked at Kieran and said, "Hi, brother," her voice rough from screaming. And Kieran said, "Hi, sister." And something in his chest that had been frozen for 300 years began, finally, to thaw. Marcus sat in Anna's forest house at exactly 11:47 p.m., 72 hours to the minute since he'd found Irina dying in that parking lot. And the symmetry felt both meaningful and arbitrary, like the universe was drawing a line under one chapter before starting the next. And Anna was wrapped in blankets on the couch, still pale and shaky from the ritual but alive, drinking the tea he'd made her with hands that only trembled slightly. And Kieran sat stiffly in an armchair by the window, perched on the edge like he might need to run at any moment. And Marcus thought about how strange it was that 3 days ago he'd been invisible, a janitor cleaning up other people's messes, and now he was sitting in a warm house with a vampire king and his newly discovered sister, bound together by blood and choice and desperate circumstance. Anna broke the silence first, her voice still rough but steady. "So, brother, tell me everything." And Kieran looked at her like she'd asked him to explain the color blue to someone who'd been blind since birth. And then he started talking, halting at first and then faster, words spilling out like he'd been holding them back for centuries. He told her about their mother, not the philanthropist whose face appeared in charity gala photographs, but the vampire queen who'd ruled through calculated ruthlessness and careful lies, who'd told him his twin was stillborn and let him mourn a sister who was actually living a normal human life 90 minutes away. Hidden and protected and utterly ignorant. And he told her about the court, about the politics and blood and fear that held vampire society together, about 300 years of being alone, always alone, the only heir, the only one who mattered. And Marcus watched Kieran's careful control crack and reform and crack again as he tried to explain an existence that defied explanation. Anna listened without interrupting, her pale eyes fixed on her brother's face, and when Kieran finally stopped talking, his voice worn down to nothing, she was quiet for a long moment before saying, "You didn't kill me. You gave up your crown to save me. That's enough for now." Kieran's expression did something complicated, relief and grief and gratitude all tangled together, and Marcus felt like he was intruding on something too private for witnesses. So he stood and said, "You two need time. I should go." But Kieran's voice stopped him before he could take a step. "Stay." Marcus turned back. "I'm not family," and Kieran said with absolute certainty, "You are now." And Anna nodded, smiling despite her exhaustion. "You protected me when you had no reason to. That makes you family. The mark is gone, but you're still here. That's a choice." And Marcus felt something in his chest unknot, something that had been tight and painful since Emma died. And he sat back down because these two broken people who'd found each other against impossible odds were offering him something he'd thought he'd lost forever, and he wasn't stupid enough to refuse. They sat together as the hours crawled toward dawn, talking in fits and starts. Anna asking questions about the vampire world with the kind of practical curiosity that made Kieran smile, and Kieran trying to navigate normal human conversation like he was learning a foreign language, and Marcus making more tea and finding blankets, and doing the small caretaking tasks that made him feel useful. And as the sky outside started to lighten, Anna's eyes drifted closed, her breathing evening out into sleep, and Kieran carefully adjusted her blankets, with movements so gentle they looked painful. Marcus stepped outside and Kieran followed, and they stood on the porch watching mist rise through the cedars, the forest silver and quiet, dawn light filtering through branches in pale gold shafts, and the air smelled like wet earth and wood smoke, and the particular clean scent that came after rain. And Marcus said, "What will you do now? Cassia is still on the council. She'll move against you eventually." Kieran's expression hardened, something cold and determined settling into his features. Let her try. She thinks she won because I kept the throne. She doesn't realize I stopped playing by her rules. And he turned to look at Marcus. I'm going to dismantle the council, rebuild the court into something that doesn't devour its own. It will take decades. I'll make enemies. I'll probably die trying. But I'm done ruling the way my mother taught me. I'm done choosing power over everything else. Marcus felt the weight of that statement, the enormity of what Kieran was proposing, and he said, "You'll need allies." And Kieran's voice softened. "I'll need someone who reminds me why it matters. Someone who stands between monsters and innocence even when it's suicidal. Someone who tells me the truth." And he was looking at Marcus now with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "You're exactly what I need, if you're willing." Marcus thought about his studio apartment, about 5 years of night shifts and deliberate invisibility, about the small, safe life he'd built to avoid ever holding someone else's survival in his inadequate hands. And then he thought about Anna's courage, about Kieran's choice to give up everything for family, about the guardian mark that had forced him to matter again, and he realized he didn't want to go back, didn't want to be invisible anymore, didn't want to spend the rest of his life running from the memory of his sister's face. "I'm a janitor," he said. "I'm not built for vampire politics." And Kieran stepped closer. "You stood up to a king, you bluffed a council of elders, you held my sister's hand while she burned. You're exactly what I need, if you're willing." And Marcus heard the question beneath the words, heard Kieran asking him to stay, not just for Anna, but for him, for whatever this fragile connection between them might become. And Marcus said, "I'm willing." Kieran's smile was rare and genuine, and gone almost before Marcus could register it, replaced by something more complicated. "Good, because I just received word that 3 other vampire courts heard about tonight's drama. They're coming to Portland to assess stability. We have a week to prepare." And Marcus laughed, exhausted and exhilarated and slightly hysterical. "Of course we do." They turned to go back inside, and Anna was awake, watching them through the window with a knowing smile that made Marcus wonder exactly how much she'd heard. And she opened the door. "You're staying for breakfast, both of you. And Kieran, you're going to learn how to make pancakes like a normal person." And Kieran looked genuinely horrified. "I don't cook. I haven't cooked in 3 centuries." And Anna just grinned. "Then it's time to relearn, brother. Come on." Inside the warm kitchen, Anna pulled out flour and eggs and milk, talking Marcus through her grandmother's recipe while Kieran stood awkwardly by the counter. And when Anna handed him an egg and told him to crack it, he held it like it might explode. And Marcus watched a 300-year-old vampire king struggle with basic breakfast preparation and felt laughter bubble up in his chest, real laughter, the kind he hadn't experienced since before Emma died. Kieran cracked the egg too hard and got shell everywhere and swore in a language that sounded like Latin, but older, harsher. And Anna laughed, and Marcus laughed, and even Kieran's mouth twitched toward something like amusement. And they stood in the golden morning light making terrible pancakes, flour on the counters, and eggshells in the batter. And Marcus caught his reflection in the window glass and saw someone he almost didn't recognize. Not the man who'd failed his sister, not the invisible janitor hiding from responsibility, but someone who'd chosen to protect a stranger and succeeded, someone who'd stood up to a vampire king and lived, someone who had a family again, even if that family was strange and fragile and built from crisis. The mark was gone from his palm, but the silver scar remained, faint but permanent, and Marcus pressed his thumb against it and thought, "Proof, evidence that this all really happened, that I made a choice that mattered." Outside, beyond the warm circle of the house, a black sedan sat idling at the forest road's edge, hidden in the early morning shadows, and inside an elder vampire held a phone to their ear and said, "Volkov has anchored himself to 2 humans. One is his sister, the other is uncertain but clearly significant. Both are leverage," and after a pause, "Yes, proceed with the Portland assessment. Let's see how strong his new convictions really are when we test them properly." The call ended, the sedan's engine purred to life, and it drove away down the forest road, leaving no trace except tire tracks in the wet gravel that would disappear with the next rain. And inside the house, none of them noticed, because Anna was trying to flip a pancake and failing spectacularly, batter splattering across the stove, and Kieran was attempting to help and making it worse, and Marcus was laughing so hard his ribs hurt, and the moment felt impossibly fragile and impossibly precious, like something that could shatter at the slightest pressure, but was beautiful exactly because of that fragility. Anna finally managed to produce something vaguely pancake-shaped, burned on one side and raw in the middle, and she presented it with exaggerated pride. Breakfast is served, and they ate the terrible pancakes anyway, sitting around Anna's kitchen table as full morning light streamed through the windows, and Kieran said, "This is awful." And Anna said, "I know, isn't it great?" And Marcus thought about how this was probably the first normal family breakfast Kieran had experienced in 300 years. The first time he'd sat at a table with people who cared about him without calculation or political maneuvering, and he watched the Vampire King struggle with the unfamiliar intimacy of it, watched him relax incrementally, watched the walls he'd built over centuries start to come down brick by brick. They talked about what came next, about the vampire courts arriving in Portland, about Kieran's plan to reform the system from within, about how to keep Anna safe while everything else fell apart and rebuilt itself. And Marcus realized he was part of the planning now, his opinion sought and valued, and it was terrifying and exhilarating and exactly what he needed. Anna asked, "So what do I do? Do I just go back to my normal life and pretend none of this happened?" And Kieran said, "You do whatever you want. You're free now, fully human. No claim to the throne, no political value. You can walk away." And Anna looked at him like he was an idiot. "I just found out I have a brother who gave up everything to save me. I'm not walking away. I'm staying right here. You're stuck with me." And Kieran's expression did that complicated thing again. Gratitude and fear and desperate hope. And he said quietly, "I don't know how to be a brother." And Anna said, "Neither do I. We'll figure it out together." Marcus stood to clear the dishes, and Kieran stopped him with a hand on his wrist, the touch light but deliberate. "Thank you for everything. For protecting her. For standing up to me. For staying." And Marcus looked at the Vampire King's pale eyes and saw something there that made his breath catch, something raw and vulnerable, and utterly unlike the cold predator he'd met in the glass citadel 4 days ago, and he said, "You're welcome," and meant it completely. Outside the forest was fully awake now, birds calling in the cedars, sunlight breaking through the canopy in golden shafts. And the world beyond Anna's sanctuary was still dangerous, still full of enemies and political machinations and vampire courts coming to test Kieran's resolve. But for now, in this moment, they were safe. The three of them together in the warm house, broken people who'd found each other and chosen family over everything else. And Marcus thought, "This is enough. For now, this is enough. We'll face whatever comes next together, and that's more than I've had in 5 years." Kieran was still holding his wrist, thumb pressed against the faint silver scar where the guardian mark had been, and Marcus didn't pull away, and Anna watched them with that knowing smile and said nothing, and the morning stretched out peaceful and temporary and perfect, and they let themselves have this quiet moment before the next crisis hit, before the vampire courts arrived, before Cassia made her next move, before the long, dangerous work of rebuilding began, and Marcus looked at Kieran and Anna and thought, "Family. This is what family feels like, messy and complicated and worth fighting for, worth dying for if it came to that." And he'd spent 5 years running from exactly this kind of connection. But now that he had it again, he wasn't letting go. Not for anything. Not ever.